Hello, my name is Matt Bowker, and I manage Rhodes Scholars Virtual Lecture Series, and it's my pleasure to host this virtual lecture. And today, you will be hearing from Dr. Lois Ellen Frank. Lois is a Santa Fe-based chef focused on Native American foods. She is also a Native American food historian, culinary anthropologist, photographer, and James Beard award-winning author. She is a featured instructor of the Southwest Indian Nations at the Santa Fe School of Cooking and is a chef and owner of Red Mesa Cuisine, along with Native Chef Walter Whitewater of the Diné Nation.
Thank you, Matthew. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to everybody who's tuning in. My name is Lois Ellen Frank, and my background is I am from the Quinoa Nation on my mom's side and Sephardic on my dad's side. We're going to talk today about the history of Native American cuisine. And in order to understand the history of Native American cuisine, we need to understand that the history plays a crucial role in how to use Native American ingredients from the past to reclaim and revitalize food for health and wellness. But before we start that, we need to ask a crucial question. What is Native American cuisine? And Native American cuisine is probably one of the most underrepresented and misunderstood cuisines anywhere in the United States and throughout the Americas. So I call this going back to the future. You go back to the past to understand the future. And when we use ancestral ancient foods in contemporary kitchens, we can reclaim a new Native American cuisine based on both wild and cultivated plants for the past, for health and wellness, and to solve contemporary problems. Probably one of the biggest terms that I want you to walk away understanding today is something called TEK. TEK is a traditional ecological knowledge, and it includes language, stories, songs, medicine that we can implement to create a positive change in the areas of health and healing. This is one of my most favorite models of TEK. Every culture in the world has TEK, and this is based on factual observations that go back thousands of years, management systems, and we all know now that managing the ecology or the area that we live in is very important, past and current uses, and then ethics and values. Native Americans have their own ideological ethics and values associated with how to harvest, how to plant, and how to deal with native foods. And then all of these components together are culture and identity. So cosmology, which is really another word for how do we look at ourselves in the world, is the model that I want you to understand for TEK. This is a map, and this is a really good map. You can see New Mexico, which is where I am today in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this is where the Rhodes Scholar program is. And if you're part of the Rhodes Scholar program in the future, one of the things that you get to do when you come on this program is you get to come to my house and you get to have a meal with many of the foods that I'm going to talk about. So it's an exclusive arrangement that I have with Rhodes Scholar, and it's part of the Rhodes Scholar family that we have, and I welcome you into my home. So while looking at this map, you can see that chilies are a major part of this, the pine nut, and then the bison. And then there are other parts in the United States where you can see wild rice around the Great Lakes, maple syrup. East Coast is what we call the Clambake Nation, and then the Salmon Nation up in the Northwest Coast. So there are 4 periods that make up Native American cuisine. The pre-contact period, which includes Native American ancestral foods that are both cultivated and wild, that were used before contact with anyone outside of indigenous nations. The second, the first contact period, and the first contact period will vary depending on where you are in the United States. Here in the Southwest, that includes the Spanish and the foods that the Spanish brought to the native people here in this area. The third period, the government issue period, which was a period when native people were relocated onto reservations, the BIA was formed, and foods were issued to native people, including some of the ingredients that I'm going to talk about today. And then we're going to end with the new native. The new native is where we are now. It's a very exciting place to be. And these are foods that native chefs like myself and Walter Whitewater and other native chefs are using to reclaim and revitalize for health and wellness. And these are the foods that we serve when we do the Native Rhodes Scholar dinner. So there are 8 ingredients that existed prior to contact: corn, beans, squash, chili, tomato, potato, vanilla, and cacao. And if you think about this, that means that up until 1492, none of these foods existed outside of the Americas. So to contextualize that, that means that the Italians did not have the tomato, the Irish did not have the potato, half the British national dish did not exist, right? They had their fish, they did not have their chips, and the French had no confection using vanilla or cacao. So this means that these foods that native people gave to the world changed the old world forever, as foods from the old world changed the native world forever. So 3 of the most dominant are corn, beans, and squash. This is also called the 3 sisters. These are high in protein, nutrients, and low in saturated fat. And what's interesting about these 3 is that it's not only the nutrients that they provide, but the way they grow. Corn needs nitrogen from the soil to grow. Beans give nitrogen. They form this relationship. Beans need a pole to climb up. Corn is the perfect stalk for the beans to climb up. And squash has big leaves shading the ground, keeping moisture in and shading the ground so that weeds can't grow. So there's a relationship between these. Corn is the dominant grain to the Americas. It is one of the most important to Native Americans, and I call this the essence of life. You can think about rice being the dominant grain in both India and Asia, and wheat being the dominant grain in Europe. Beans, very important. This is a photo of the tepary bean, one of my most favorite beans, and we use this bean to cook and make a bean paint that we use on some of the foods that we serve in our Rhodes Scholar program. This little bean, 23 to 30% higher in protein than any other bean on the planet. And it's full of oil, calcium, magnesium, zinc, phosphorus, potassiums, yet lower in polyunsaturated, so a plant-based fat. It's a slow release food and perfect for diabetics. So beans, very, very important when we think about this idea of reclaiming our food and our diet for health and wellness. Squash, very important. We have both winter squash and summer squash. Summer squash include all of the squash that have a soft outside, so you eat the outside. Winter squash, hard shell outside, where you do not eat the outside. So the pumpkin, winter squash. The little zucchini and the zucchini blossoms, summer squash. We also have chilies. Chili is one of my most favorite of the Magic 8. 1 green chili has the equivalent in vitamin C of 6 oranges. They're antifungal, antibacterial, completely probiotic. And chilies can be used on the skin, sore muscles, sore aches, sore joints, sore pains. And you can buy this at any drugstore under the name capsaicin. Tomatoes, also very important. They're another example of an indigenous food to the Americas that are now widely used and part of the Magic 8. Potatoes, very important. Potatoes go back about 7,000 to 10,000 years. And upon first contact, there were hundreds and hundreds of varieties of potatoes. We now know through some of the blue zones, which National Geographic has published, that the potato is a wonderful food, and especially the sweet potato, which we all need to be eating much more of and incorporating into our diet. Vanilla did not exist. I think the most fascinating thing for me about vanilla is how did the ancestors know that this little bean, this long black bean of an orchid, was going to be so delicious and combined with one of its favorite sisters, cacao. Here we have a picture of cacao in its fresh stage. Those beans are then toasted and roasted. That is made into cacao powder. And then with the addition of chocolate used now and one of the most famous ingredients in many, many desserts. So food is our medicine. It nurtures us, it sustains us. Very, very important when we look at native foods. But it's not only the cultivated foods that have important, it's also the wild foods in the Native American diet and in Native American history. Here we have the pecan. We can see the pecan region on this map. It's actually an Algonquin word that means it's a nut requiring a stone to break it. And it was in fact the crows that could break it open, fly with it, and that's how it spread. Pecans, 100 grams, yields tons of nutrients, good fat, and so this is a very important food in the ancestral Native American diet. Also, the pine nut, very important, especially here in this area. Pine nuts, 100 grams, which is about a half a cup, yield 673 calories. So when there was no wild game, this nut provided essential calories and fat for Native people. And so we incorporate this into a wonderful dessert, which we serve at our Rhodes Scholar program, called the Pecan Torte, which is actually dark chocolate with pine nuts. Here we have the chokecherry. I have in my front yard what's called an edible landscape. We harvest chokecherries every year, which we boil down and make into a syrup, and that's served with the dessert for the Rhodes Scholar program. Kota tea, another wild food, very important, also served at our Rhodes Scholar program, and free because we hand harvest it. I actually buy this from a husband and wife, and a very important food here in the Southwest. Ceremonies have always honored our sacred foods. And in Native American tradition, we give gratitude to everything we hunt and everything we harvest. The bison, here you can see bison. Many of the pueblos and tribes are reintroducing. There's a program called the Intertribal Bison Cooperative. So 35 tribes in 17 Western states are reintroducing the bison and bringing this back. Here we see the bison being honored and used in many of our dances. First contact period, what did Europeans bring? Probably the biggest and the most profound were sheep, pork, beef, wheat, apples, peaches, apricots, and other stone fruits, and then watermelons, cabbage, and wine grapes. And what's fascinating about this, because Native people only hunted wild game, no dairy. So if you think about this, you might think about trying to milk a wild bison, but she would probably either run away or charge you. And so you couldn't get close enough to the others. So there was no dairy, no cheese, no butter, no cream. And so the biggest and most profound introductions from the old world to Native people were some of these domesticated animals and their byproducts. Here are some photos of figs and cherries, different ingredients, wheat that was introduced from Europeans, and now Native American cuisine weaves together the ingredients that were introduced with the ingredients that already existed in this area. Government issue came around in the 18 and 1900s. After forced relocation onto reservations, Native communities lost their agricultural and hunting basis for food, and so the US government issued commodity foods. These commodity foods included lard, flour, sugar, coffee, and from this was born the fry bread and the infamous Indian taco. And of all the tribes that exist, almost every tribe knows how to make fry bread and an Indian taco. And if you've ever gone to a feast or a Native American powwow, this is one of the foods that's going to be served at that powwow. So it's only in the recent history, approximately 150 years or so ago, by forcibly being distributed these foods, that the health and wellness has declined of Native American communities, and the health has drastically changed. Every culture in the world has a version of fried dough, fried bread, but we only eat it once or twice a year. So if you begin to eat these foods every day, you're going to see health disparities. And that's what we see now in Native American communities. Native Americans have one of the highest rate of type 2 diabetes in the United States. And so by returning to those first two periods, the pre-contact and the first contact period, what we see is a turn and a reclaiming and a revitalization of health and wellness in Native American communities. The new Native American cuisine is where we are now. And this is currently being defined in all communities. It can include foods from all of these three distinct historic periods, but these foods are innovatively combined or fused. What is fusion food? Fusion food is actually the fusing together of ingredients from one period into another. And so this brings back the metaphor, food is our medicine. And this is what we're reclaiming, and I think is the most important and most exciting period for a diet that fits different Native American community needs. Here are some examples of very old foods that are new. So again, we're going back to the past to move forward to the future. We see a squash fry. We see a corn soup with a little paint. The corn soup is one of the dishes that we serve in our Rhodes Scholar program. Tamales made from blue corn, little gnocchis, a bean salad with wild rice, and then chilies with beans. Here again is another very simple dish, reclaiming using sunflower seeds. This is called a sunflower cake, and we're serving it here with a wild herb compote. Again, squash fried guacamole, which many of you may think of as actually being a dish to the south of us, is actually a Native American dish that Native people used and have used for millennia, and very, very healthy. It has good fats, has lots of ingredients for health and wellness. The Native American food movement is a movement that has been birthed out of this new period. And this is what's exciting, is that all of you can join into this movement. There's room for everyone. Native American communities around the world actively are maintaining, renewing, revitalize their traditional foodways. And some of the ways they're doing this is through land restoration, access, heirloom seed saving, so bringing back and using those indigenous seeds, traditional farming practices and wild food gathering, cooking and nutrition classes on Native American and traditional foods. And what that does is it revitalizes the cultural, the spiritual, and the physical connections between the environment and community for health and wellness. So how can we do this? How can you all participate and become part of this movement? You can go online and buy indigenous ingredients. I buy indigenous ingredients every time I do a Rhodes Scholar meal for the Rhodes Scholar program. And here's an example. Tamaya is the indigenous word for Santa Ana Pueblo. They grow their own blue corn. I buy that corn, they mill it, they grind it, and then I bake blue cornbread for all of my guests at the Rhodes Scholar program to enjoy. So this is just one way that we're using these ingredients to reclaim and revitalize by buying from indigenous nations all over the United States. Probably one of the most fascinating things, and this is a picture of the soup that we serve with the blue cornbread in our Rhodes Scholar program. And most people think that it takes many generations for something to disappear. Well, it actually takes one generation. So in all of our traditions, in all of our histories, if my mother didn't teach me a story, a recipe, a language, the history of who I am, then I can't pass that on to the next generation. So it actually takes one generation for something to disappear. So the spiral represents the indigenous knowledge starting at the beginning of time, spiraling outward, and the 4 dots represent 4 generations: child, adolescent, middle-aged, and elder. And if any one of those generations doesn't carry on that knowledge in all of our traditions, then it's broken, and that cultural tradition, information, story, recipe, food can be lost or forgotten. So it's very important to carry on these traditions in Native American cuisine. Here's a photo of Chef Walter Whitewater painting. We take great pride in taking our dishes, bringing them into the contemporary condition. So we take ancestral foods, bring them into the modern kitchen, and then use symbolism, whether it's dots or spirals, not only for a beautiful presentation, for artwork, but to educate the public as they eat a delicious meal. So what happens here? Well, there's a new paradigm and there's a new outcome that comes from all of this information. Once we activate the TEK that you learned about a little bit earlier in this presentation, you can activate the ancestral knowledge using indigenous ways of knowing. And you can understand and begin to pass these on. And everybody can pass on traditional knowledge from their own traditions. We also create and we embed indigenous cultural links into standards of indigenous cuisine. And we transition, and this is very important, from a Western methodology to both a Western or European and native. And the two can work in tandem. TEK is a native form in science, which can work very well with a Western ideological approach to science. So we weave them together and we bring them together so that they can work in tandem and carry on this important information for health and wellness. We also recover social values by using indigenous foods. And as more and more people get sick, and what's fascinating is that type 2 diabetes no longer sees age or ethnicity. And so all of us want to become healthy and well. And many of these practices that we're using in Native American communities can also be used in all of our communities to reclaim and revitalize health and wellness for each of us. We use teaching methods that inform on the history of Native American foods, agricultural practices, wild food harvesting, the metaphor that food is our medicine. And this is also important because if we look to the past, food was in fact our medicine, and we can reclaim this and we can eat. I call it eating the rainbow. So each plate that you eat should have lots of color on it. And this is how we reclaim health and wellness, and we make informed decisions. That term knowledge is power, very important, because once you have knowledge about something, you can choose to ignore it, or you can choose to embrace it and use that knowledge to reclaim your own health and wellness. We strengthen community partnerships with both local, tribal, state, and federal programs and services that support food systems for health and wellness, with an outcome in the area of Native American foods and cuisine. And then we identify resources that assure accessibility to safe, fresh, and healthy foods, both from a physical access, but also a financial access. How do we make these foods available to everyone, regardless of their economic place in the world? And so we do this by forming partnerships. And this is one of the reasons I love the Rhodes Scholar programs, and I love working with Rhodes Scholar. Their mission is to educate. And so we're honored to be able to take programs, serve a delicious meal as part of the Santa Fe and Taos program, and educate through a partnership. And Indigenous partnerships focus where the Native American agenda takes priority, but that all groups, all nations, all people can participate in this partnership, and none of us can do it alone. I think a good metaphor would be if I lived on a river and I was really protecting that river and not polluting it, but my neighbors to the north of me and my neighbors to the south of me were polluting the river. Do I make a difference? And the answer is no. We need to do this together. Native Americans have a medicine wheel, 4 colors: yellow, white, black, and red. Those are the 4 colors on the medicine wheel. Those are the 4 colors of corn. Those are the 4 directions. And so in order to make our earth a wonderful home and a wonderful place to be for health and wellness for all of its members, we need to form partnerships, and that's where all of you can participate and become part of this through the Rhodes Scholar program. And so how does this happen? Well, our Native youth are the ones to carry on these traditions. So it's very important. This is a photo actually of Tidra and Calandra. Calandra was raised on the reservation, Tidra in an urban area. But together, all of this knowledge, all of this indigenous knowledge comes together, and we carry on these traditional foods from the knowledge of our ancestors. I always tell my students, because I teach an indigenous food class at the Institute of American Indian Arts, we're in an area of technology. Use your cell phone, use that voice memo setting, ask questions, tape record the elders, and then use that information to pass on the traditions, the TEK, the traditional ecological knowledge of our ancestors to our youth so that we can perpetuate health and wellness, and we can all come together as one and learn about who we are and how to be the healthiest that we can in today's times. And so I'm going to end there, and we're going to bring in some questions. I think our host, Matt, is going to ask you for questions, and I'd be happy to answer all of those. And it's been a pleasure. This is being tape recorded, so you will be able to take a look at this again. There's a lot of information that I just processed, but I hope you walk away with something that you can participate in and become a part of important programs like the program we're talking about today through our Rhodes Scholar family.
Great, thank you, Lois. So indeed, we do have questions coming in. Our first question is from Anne, and she asks, I've always been curious as to how the Native Americans figured which wild foods were edible to eat and which were not. And any thoughts on how they discovered this?
So this is great, and this is perfect question because this is TEK. So how did ancestors figure out how to harvest vanilla? How did they know which mushrooms were edible? What about wild greens in the spring? Trial and error. We go back to that original model that I showed you at the beginning of the slideshow. So through trial and error, factual observations, Native Americans took this knowledge and then passed it down orally. So it's very important to pass down this information and bring the youth out on how to harvest and how to know which plants are edible and which are not. And sometimes it can be very dangerous, right? Mushrooms tend to be poisonous. So somewhere along that historical trajectory, someone in a tribe or a community ate a mushroom that was not edible. They got sick, or in some instances maybe died, and then the rest of the tribe knew that that was not an edible mushroom. And so that TEK, that information, had to be passed on so that future generations would know what to do.
Great. Linda has a question. On reservations, are they allowed to cultivate these native plants, and can they?
Yes. We have a program, and we work with organizations such as the New Mexico Department of Health. We work directly with tribes. We implement gardens so that Native people can learn how to plant the Three Sisters together and have small gardens. And actually, no matter where you live, you could have a garden. I have a beautiful chili plant that I'm staring with across my table here. So you can plant anything from herbs in your own house to actually raised beds, small gardens, to very large gardens. So we have an initiative where we are working with Native communities on planting gardens and using those cultivars for health and wellness and to supply food to their communities.
Thank you. We have a question from Mary. Are food allergies common among Indigenous peoples, and how does the traditional diet impact people with serious food allergies?
That's another excellent question. So we see a lot of food allergies sort of in mainstream America today. For instance, gluten is a problematic allergy. And I call it, one of my students calls it blood memory. I call it ancestral DNA. So all of us are indigenous to somewhere. My background is Native American on my mom's side, Sephardic on my dad. So if I look at both of those ethnic traditions, none of those traditions ate a lot of dairy. So I don't do well with dairy. I can process a little bit of cheese. I do better with goat cheese than cow cheese, but I don't do well with dairy. And yet I used to be married to an Irish Scotsman. And if we look at his ancestral DNA, dairy was a big part of who he was. He can sit down and drink a pint of milk and feel absolutely comforted and very fine. If I try and drink a pint of milk, I'm not going to feel very well afterwards. So again, look back in your own ancestral DNA. What is your background, and what are some of the foods that your ancestors ate? And then if you eat those foods, how do you feel? If you drink milk or you eat dairy and you don't feel well, then you may be prone to having lactose intolerant issues, and maybe that's a food that you want to stay away from. Another is wheat. Here in the United States, we're actually one of the only countries in the world where not only are we genetically modifying our wheat, but we're stripping it of all its nutrients. Many Native Americans don't do well with wheat, although they can process some. They do better with corn. So it would be better for them to have a corn tortilla or a piece of cornbread as opposed to wheat. And so that's an excellent question, and one that all of us need to address. Food is your fuel. Food is your medicine. So when you eat a meal, you should feel good. You shouldn't feel tired, and you shouldn't want to lie down on the couch and go to sleep. And if you do, then you want to take a look at what you're eating, and is that food servicing you and giving you the nutrients that you need?
Thank you. So we have lots of questions about I'm not pronouncing this correct, the tepary beans. So Tom, for instance, asks, I've never heard of these beans and wonder if there's another name under which they are sold. And we have other people asking where they can get those beans. And then Tom also wants to mention that the dinner at your home was the highlight of his Santa Fe program.
Woohoo! Oh, well, thank you, Tom. So the tepary is an indigenous bean. I buy the tepary from Ramona Farms. I'll have to double check that. I believe if you plug in Ramona Farms, it's either .org or .com. It may be .com. And you can actually purchase those beans. They come in black, white, and brown. You can also buy those beans directly from Native Seed Search. So Native Seed /Search, which is an indigenous organization out of Tucson, Arizona. And you can buy the teparies from them. Now the teparies are heirloom. So not only can you cook the beans and eat them, and I make some of the best hummuses in the world from the tepary bean, all kinds of different hummus. We call it a bean spread because hummus is actually a Middle Eastern term, but you can use it in soups or stews, but you can also plant those beans. So anytime you buy a bean that's heirloom, you can eat them, but you can also plant them. So Ramona Farms, go on their website, or Native Seed Search.
Okay, Beverly asks, I thought you'd indicated corn along with beans and squash is a low sugar. Isn't it rather high in sugar and high carbs broken down to sugar? A concern for me is that she's type 1 diabetic.
So type 1 diabetes is a little bit different, but what we have found from the people that we've been working with that have type 1 diabetes is when they increase their plant intake, and when you have a heavy plant-based diet, you're always going to need insulin, but it's going to help regulate that insulin. You're thinking of corn as sweet corn. And the idea of eating sweet corn or going to the supermarket and buying corn on the cob is very European. Native people ate sweet corn once a year. Our corn is what's called a flour corn. So the corn has been allowed to grow until it goes from a sugar starch period to a flour period. That corn flour, or that corn meal, which I buy from Tamaya, and also Tamaya does have a website. It's called The Cooking Post, and you can buy cornmeal from them. That cornmeal is a slow release food. It's not like eating corn or yellow corn kernels or the white corn, which is actually a hybrid sweet corn that you see in the grocery store. All beans, very slow release. So that's another great food. And then squash, full of vitamin A, full of vitamin C, lots of water. And so when we combine those three together, you get lots of nutrients, and it is a slow release food. So I make a Three Sisters stew and a Three Sisters taco all the time. And instead of eating it on white fluffy bread, which does form and is digested in the body very quickly into glucose, which is sugar. So that would be a high release. Any type of cinnamon bun or any of the processed foods are gonna go into sugar very quickly in the body. Flatbreads, like a corn tortilla, very slow release. So excellent question.
Carol asks, before the second contact period, did different indigenous groups merge their foods as they migrated or wandered? If so, is this still considered first contact?
Okay, another excellent question. So I had to pare down my slideshow a little bit, and I actually removed the slide that showed. But prior to contact, so my research and my PhD goes back about 10,000 years, up until first contact, which is about, give or take, 1,500 years ago. Many food historians say that 1491 1492, and 1493 was the year that the world began in terms of food, because so much happened so quickly. So from about 10,000 years ago, up until first contact with Europeans, native people traded. And those trade routes, much more extensive than we originally thought. In 2009, scientists at the University of New Mexico were on an archaeological dig in Chaco Canyon, also located in New Mexico, and they found a vessel. In the vessel was theobromine. Theobromine is the marker for chocolate. And once they radiocarbon dated that, so using Western science, it told these scientists that this ingredient was about 1,000 to 1,400 years old. So chocolate was in Chaco Canyon over 1,000 years ago. So what does that tell us? That the trade routes, areas like Chaco Canyon, were much more diverse. They weren't an area where civilizations disappeared. They were actually a convention center or a trading hub. And so Native American nations traded. In Chaco Canyon, they also found parrot feathers. That's coming from the south. Abalone shells coming from probably California in those areas above Los Angeles with the Chumash in what is now Santa Barbara. And other ingredients like cotton, which were grown by native people to the south. So there were areas that native people traded, and they traded extensively. And those trade routes, much more diverse and much of greater distance than scientists originally thought. They've also, 2 years ago, found quinoa in North Dakota. And that was radiocarbon dated at over 2,000 years old, telling us that quinoa was in North Dakota over 2,000 years ago. And while some of these ingredients can be transplanted, quinoa will grow, for instance, in Colorado. It certainly grows here in northern New Mexico. But these ingredients were brought north and used to trade. And we know quinoa, which is a super grain, very, very healthy and should be incorporated, in fact, into an indigenous diet for health and wellness.
Alan asks, do you incorporate Sephardic ingredients into your recipes?
So that's another great question. So when I do the Rhodes Scholar programs, what I always say is that you never undo who you are. When I do a Native American meal, you get the Sephardic knowledge and ingredients from my grandmother on that side for free. And when I do my Sephardic traditions, and right now, actually today's Good Friday, but we have Passover and the Christian holidays overlapping this year. You get the native for free, so you get a bonus regardless of what kind of meal I'm cooking for you, and it's just in there. We don't undo who we are; it's an additive process. So that fusing together, that fusion, is always a part of everything I do. And both my grandmothers had something that they called non-tangible ingredients, and I don't know about all of you, but one of the things that we pride ourselves in at Red Mesa is we have what's called leave it at the door policy. So when my staff comes to do an event or to do a dinner or a meal, all of your problems need to stay at the door. And so we come in and we call in the ancestors and what we bring forth. And I don't know about all of you, but I know both my grandmas, even though they cooked very different foods, you know how your grandma's food is just so good. Oh, grandma, right? Grandma, it's just so good. Why is it so good? Because my grandma's used, you can call it fairy dust, but I call it the non-tangible essence of their love. And so their love, their feeling, their ancestral knowledge is put into everything they do. And that's one of the things that we try and do at Red Mesa is we incorporate and bring in that love into every dish we prepare for every person we feed.
Thank you. We have a question from Jack. This is a broad question, how were native foods prepared?
So
maybe you can give just a couple examples, because
okay.
That's a big question.
So step one for me is I know every farmer, I know every husband and wife, I know everybody that provides the food for me. So all of my purveyors, all of my harvesters, all of the people I buy ingredients from, I know who they are, I know how they harvest, I know the quality of the ingredients and the processes that they use. I then take those ingredients and then I prepare them into a variety of dishes using that ancestral knowledge and present them in a very contemporary way. So for instance, if I'm making the bean paint, which we use that you saw on that corn soup. We're going to use a white bean, which we slowly cook overnight. That's going to be combined with a roasted red bell pepper. We're going to blend that together, maybe use a little bit of chili for a little bit of spice, bringing in that spice of life. We're going to put it in a squirt bottle, and then we're going to paint that on the corn soup that you're going to get if you come to the Rhodes Scholar program here in Santa Fe. So we're using modern techniques in the kitchen and ancestral knowledge and those ingredients to present them in a modern way. So we call it ancestral foods with a modern twist.
All right. I'm probably also not going to be able to pronounce this, but Elizabeth asks, could you say a few words about the Chiricahua and Mescalero Apache traditional and ceremonial foods? I'm sorry, Elizabeth.
So the Mescalero tribe is located in southern New Mexico. The Chiricahua tribe will border New Mexico and Arizona. The Apache tribes are famous for their use of acorn or acorn flour. They also incorporate many wild foods that are harvested. Right now we're coming into spring, and so you're going to see those baby greens. They also hunted, but many of those foods, each particular community has specialty foods only unique to their region. And again, we go back to TEK. What are the foods that existed in your ecological region? And then we encourage those tribes to use those foods, incorporate them, ancestral foods, again, into their modern dishes, reclaim and revitalize for health and wellness.
Okay, so we have time for one more question, and you have definitely inspired a lot of people to go out and buy these ingredients. Donna wants to know, where is the best place to shop for fresh produce and herbs and spices, in your opinion?
Well, again, without knowing where you're from, I think everybody's concerned, where do you get the best quality ingredients at the best price? And so different stores. Here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I belong to a program called Squash Blossom. Squash Blossom is our farm to table program. And so I would encourage you, first and foremost, do you have a farmer's market where you live? And if you do, what can you buy there? Can you buy locally raised organic meats? Can you buy indigenous foods? Can you buy fresh produce? Can you buy farm eggs? Once you've eaten a farm egg, you will never want to go back to a commercial egg. So when are those farmers markets? When do they have them? Are they available? Can you go there once a week? Then secondary, you could look at different stores. What stores are available in your area? Here we have Trader Joe's, which is great for dry goods, some produce. We have Whole Foods, also very good for fresh produce, Sprouts, and then also different supermarkets. So I start with farmers market, and then I go to stores that have fresh produce. Me personally, if I can afford to, I go for organic first. If I cannot, I look at commercial. I would encourage all of you listening today to look up what's called the Dirty Dozen. The Dirty Dozen are the 12 most pesticide foods in fresh produce, and switch to organic, starting with those 12. There's also something called the Clean 15. Look that up, Google that. What is the Clean 15? As harmful in terms of pesticides, because those pesticides, like for instance, on the Clean 15 is an avocado, you're not eating the outside, so you're not getting those pesticides. So Dirty Dozen, those ones you want to switch to organic. Clean 15, those are acceptable, even if they're grown conventionally or commercially, and look for a farmer's market in your area and try and buy local. Those foods are the healthiest and the safest, especially during the times that we're in now.
All right, well, unfortunately, we have to end it. So this concludes our webinar. So thanks to everyone, and a big thanks to Lois.
Bye-bye.